Hey everyone, this is Ezekiel O'Callahan with Raptor Chatter, and we're going to be looking at what happened in December 2022 in paleontology. And we're going to do a pretty deep dive. There's going to be a lot of papers here, so let's get started. To start, we're going to be looking at some of the things that I really like, which are microvertebrates, where essentially you just have to go through the sediment piece by piece and kind of find little vertebrate fossils. This is something that I find wildly interesting because the small forms of life I really like in the fossil record. But anyway, these fossils come from Niger during the Middle Cretaceous, and there's a lot of different things. There's some crocodilians and some turtle pieces, as well as a lot of fish pieces. But altogether, this does help us to start piecing together more of what was happening in Africa during the Middle Cretaceous, because we already have some places in Africa that are really well represented during this time, such as in some parts of Egypt and Morocco. But Niger's been a little bit undersampled, so this is really helping us to start piecing together some of what was going on in that part of Africa at this time. And sticking with smaller animals, we're actually going to be looking at the Triassic with an early squamate. The squamates are the things like lizards, but also their close relatives, the rhynchocephalians, like the modern-day Tuatara, which is the only modern rhynchocephalian. And I've already actually talked about this paper once in my top 10 paleo subjects of the year video, so feel free to check that out. But this paper is basically going, hey, we have a new squamate from about 200 million years ago when we thought they first started to diverge and started to diversify into all the different groups. And from that one, it's actually really, really late diverging. So it's a late diverging squamate that's when they were very first just diverging, which really doesn't necessarily mean that that's when they diverged. Instead, it probably means they may have actually diverged even earlier. Now, phylogenetically, they found it to be an anguiform lizard, again, a late diverging group, and probably pretty close to the varanids, which are things like the monitor lizards. And so because of that, it was given the name Cryptovaranoides. And again, because it's so late diverging in the phylogeny, that means that the phylogeny probably started diversifying even earlier than 200 million years ago, maybe around 230 million years ago. Now, we do have some fossils of squamates from around this time, but they're pretty much literally just like a handful of jaw bones. We don't really have anything that's really distinctly a lizard. So hopefully we'll get some more fossils of those to really try and tell how much they were diversifying back then, or if it was just some kind of stem lineages that would eventually lead to the squamates, and then their diversification did happen 200 million years ago. Really just comes down to the argument of when they diversified could still fall on either part of this paper. Could have happened earlier, could have happened later like we thought. And still with some small reptiles, we have something that didn't quite sit right. And that's because it was eaten and, again, just didn't sit right with whatever ate it because it was barfed back up. Now, we don't exactly know what animal this was, but we can tell that it would have been a teleosaur. The teleosaurs were a group of crocodilians that moved back to the oceans and became very well adapted for life in the oceans. And while that's great, and we do have at least some of the parts that can tell us it was a teleosaur, we can't tell a species or anything. We really just have a handful of the osteoderms and a few vertebra that really help us to tell, yeah, this was a teleosaur. The osteoderms are bones that grow inside the skin, kind of like the modern armor that you see in many crocodilians. However, again, with the teleosaurs, it's going to be slightly different just because of their general shape and lifestyle being in the oceans. And unfortunately, we don't really know exactly what animal could have eaten this. There's a lot of animals that have come from the same location, including some short-necked plesiosaurs, which very easily could have eaten it, some larger metriorhynchid crocodilians, which also moved to the marine environments, as well as large ichthyosaurs and multiple sharks. And all of these would have enjoyed a crocodile-flavored snack, or at least they would have tried to enjoy it, since obviously this one just didn't sit right. And moving out of small reptiles and into small mammals, Mongolia has some kind of poor stratigraphic work, which just means we don't really know exactly how all of the layers of rock relate to one another. Some formations of different types may have been being laid down right next to one another in the environment, or maybe one happened first and then the other one happened. And we can tell that in some places, but we don't know the full extent of those, because some places one of those environments may not have been there as long, so it would have been a less thick layer of rock. But we, again, just haven't done all the detailed work on that stratigraphy. We haven't measured all of these different rocks and really understood them in a meaningful way. And one of the big consequences of that is that biostratigraphy has been used a lot in Mongolia, especially after the KPG extinction when the big rock came down and killed off the non-avian dinosaurs. And that's really useful with the mammals that we found in Mongolia, because we can go, oh hey, look, we have this one, and then this one, and then this one, except for this new paper that just found a new site that has essentially all of the mammals that we use for that biostratigraphy. Basically, this one site just throws a wrench into everything we thought we knew about biostratigraphy in Mongolia, which I mean, at least now we're getting more pressure to try and start addressing that question, and hopefully somebody will in the future. But again, it just really helps to show that we really do need to know some good geology in order to try and get better understanding of the biology of the animals that would have been present. And on the subject of that extinction, we're actually going to be going all the way back to North America, where the meteor probably had a pretty big impact. And to test that, they were actually looking at two formations that are on either side of the impact. Below the impact is the fossil-bearing Coruscant Formation, which is from the Cretaceous, and above is the Kincaid Formation, which is from the Paleogene. And in between, there's seemingly two different flows that were probably from the impact. And so these authors essentially looked at those flows to try and see if they could better understand what happened when the impact happened. Now, in the first of the two layers, there's no real fabric to the rock. And by that I mean is essentially when you have big flows or even smaller flows like a stream or something, the rocks still organize themselves in at least a slight pattern, which is essentially, especially when you have dunes or something like that, you're going to have all of that start to collapse, and the smaller stones are going to sink to the bottom and the heavier ones are going to rise up to the top. The first of these potential impact layers, though, doesn't have any of that. It is just a massive push and essentially giant flow that is going too heavily to sort things. So you're getting all kinds of large chunks that were ripped up from the lower formation, and all of those are being just wrapped around by mud and sand, and there's, again, not really a fabric. There's no real pattern to how the rocks and the sediments within this layer are actually organized. The other one, though, is actually a lot better sorted. It starts with some medium-sized clasts and then moves into things like some coarse sands, finer sands, and finally mud. So you can actually see where everything kind of settled out because there wasn't a flow. It was just the normal motion of the water allowing the heavier rocks to sink to the bottom first, and then the sands, and then the mud. By looking at these layers, the authors were able to kind of make a 4-stage process of how the impact would have changed this environment in Texas. And essentially the first part is the impact happens and there's seismic waves that start to disturb the sea floor. After that, all of the material that got thrown up into the sky would have started landing in the water and started settling to the bottom, but then the tsunami would have come in and that would have pushed a lot of that material back up into that heavy flow, which would have then gotten mixed up without any kind of real fabric or real organization to the rocks within that flow. Then you have a giant tsunami coming in, and that's going to be ripping up chunks of the lower formations and the other rocks that are below on the sea floor and start bringing those into that different flow layer. And again, that's why you get these kind of larger pieces with some of these muddier pieces that aren't really organized in any real way. Essentially, the flow is just moving too fast, so everything gets thrown there all at once. And then the tsunami recedes and the ocean goes back to being mostly still. And once it does, all of the extra stuff that hadn't been captured entirely in that flow would have just started settling out naturally, eventually leaving just a very barren and disastrous environment for animals that were living there. I mean, we have good evidence that there are probably a lot of things like bivalves, so clams, but also snails and things like that living on the seafloor. And then they just immediately got wiped out, at least for a brief time. Because again, the Kincaid Formation does have fossils. So they did come back after a while, but we can at least see how that impact would have immediately impacted the surrounding area of where it landed. There was also another paper looking at the extinction and why essentially the non-avian dinosaurs died out and why the mammals did so well. And what they actually did to test this is they looked at the ecospace these different animals were actually occupying. And what I mean by that is they essentially saw how important each animal was to its environment and looked at that through the last few million years before the extinction. And this is a really important part because they actually found that some dinosaurs, like the Tyrannosaurs, were occupying more important space in the environment. Essentially, they had increased their role in shaping how the environment would have been. And a lot of mammals did this too. But obviously, like if Tyrannosaurus rex is expanding its role, clearly it should have lived, right? The problem is it was expanding its role, but it was likely too specialized to make it through once that impact actually did happen because other animals also died out. So while sure it was very important as the top predator without really any competition compared to the other theropods that would have been around, it really seems like that may have been its Achilles heel. Essentially, it wasn't diverse enough in its ecospace to be able to succeed when its main system, its main focus in its ecospace actually died out, which is the large herbivores died out and then it did. Meanwhile, smaller herbivores did make it through, and that includes some mammals. And the thing is, the mammals were expanding their ecospace, but not just expanding, but diversifying. They were filling different niches and different parts of the ecospace. And that's probably why they actually eventually started to diversify so rapidly after the extinction. They had already started to diversify before it, so they already had that jump start on the other organisms that did make it through that extinction. A few years ago, there was a paper looking at the incredibly well-preserved Borealopelta, and that's because it had stomach contents, and that paper was just looking at, hey, what was in its stomach? And now there's a paper looking at the contemporaneous formation that would have been on land versus where Borealopelta was found. Because Borealopelta got washed out to sea, so it was in a marine sediment. It really didn't live there, but it did get washed out there. But again, it would have been on land, so the formation that would have been around that Borealopelta would have been living in, people looked at the plants that would have been in that formation, and they found a lot of really interesting things. First of all, there were a lot of conifer trees. In fact, about 60% of the plants were conifers, so think of things like pine trees. There were 10% that were ginkgo-like trees, and 14% were ferns with minor amounts of other types of plant life. But the thing is, when we looked at Borealopelta's stomach, it didn't have that kind of proportion at all. In fact, 85% of what it ate were those ferns. So you have 14% of it in the environment, but it's 85% of its diet, or at least this Borealopelta's diet. There's a few possibilities that do need to be considered, because maybe it was just the time of year when ferns are the most nutritious, so it was eating all of those. Maybe the pine trees at the time weren't necessarily healthy. Maybe they were going into a more toxic state because of environmental stress, so Borealopelta used other food sources. There's a lot of different possibilities, but I do think one of the most interesting ones is that Borealopelta was selectively feeding on these ferns. Especially since there was some charcoal found in Borealopelta's stomach, it is possible that after a fire went through part of the forest and all of the new regrowth of those ferns started to show up, that Borealopelta went there deliberately to feed on those ferns because maybe they were just more nutritious for it. Sticking with Ankylosaurs and, like Borealopelta, a clubless nodosaur, we have a new one coming from South America in Argentina and the Allen Formation. Patagopelta cristata is coming from the late Cretaceous of South America. And this is actually really interesting because we don't really have a ton of their fossils coming from South America, and the ones that we do have seem to be pretty early diverging, things like Stegosaurus. Additionally, Patagopelta really groups with the North American nodosaurs, which really helps to suggest that at some point during the late Cretaceous, there was a land bridge connecting North and South America, and we have a few other fossils that kind of help to suggest this. But it does help us to understand better the kind of diversity we had in Ankylosaurs in South America during the latest Cretaceous, and potentially, again, how these groups started to migrate from North to South America. And hopefully someday we'll find something like an Abelisaur in North America and be able to say, ah, look, they were coming north too, but that's something down the line. And now for the cooler Ankylosaurs, and I say that because these ones went clubbing, and I don't necessarily mean they were, dancing at a rave, but there was new evidence coming from Zool, another really well-preserved ankylosaur, that shows that it had pathological damage on some of its scutes on its back. And the thing is, when they looked at these scutes, it doesn't seem like they were bitten by anything. Instead, it seems like they were crushed by something, likely another Zool. So it's pretty likely that Zool and other ankylosaurs had their tail clubs in order to fight with one another, and they would have been essentially clubbing with one another. This seems especially true because the few young ankylosaurs that we do have fossils of don't really have this kind of tail club. It seems like it actually grew in later in life. And that's something we find in a lot of structures that are used mostly for competition between males for females, or females for males in some species. So it seems like the ankylosaurs weren't necessarily trying to break the shins of their predators, instead they were trying to break the backs of their competitors. And on the subject of fossil injuries, there was a look at Allosaurus, which lived millions of years before the Ankylosaurs, but some of those fossils had a lot of injuries, including this one. There were a few different things found, mostly with the vertebra and some of the shoulder bones. The kind of textures and inflammation they found on the back vertebra is really good evidence of spondyloarthropathy, which is a type of inflammatory arthritis, and it's the first time we've ever found this in a theropod dinosaur, so it's good to know that they were having some of the same problems we do today. The injuries on the shoulder bones, though, really show a lot of evidence that they were caused by a traumatic event, so potentially they were just bitten by a larger theropod dinosaur, even another Allosaurus. It's really hard to know for sure because they weren't preserved with any kind of teeth gouges or anything that would be really distinct in helping us know that. But importantly, all of these injuries showed signs of healing. This animal didn't die because of these injuries. Instead, it went and lived its life and still did more things and continued to grow. Now, obviously, eventually did die, but again, not from these injuries, which is really good for showing that Allosaurus at least could go through some pretty traumatic and, pretty severe pain, but still make it through life. There was also the first attempt to try and use microwear on teeth to understand the diet and feeding ecology of different theropod dinosaurs. And Tyrannosaurus and Allosaurus were actually used on this. And that's because we have a lot of specimens, both with teeth and full body or mostly full body specimens, so we can really get a good understanding of what they were trying to do. Now, microwear is essentially because whenever an animal eats something, you get teeny tiny scratches on the teeth, and that means you can start to track what it would have been eating. And what they found was actually kind of interesting. And that's because Allosaurus and Tyrannosaurus really didn't eat different things. They probably consumed about an equal amount of bone, importantly. And the reason that's important is because Tyrannosaurus rex had much bulkier teeth. It's been thought that they were using them to crack open bones and eat a lot more bones rather than at things like Allosaurus, which were thought to have eaten mostly just the softer meats. Instead, it looks like they were probably eating pretty much the same thing, so their goal was the same. However, the paper also saw that there were different directions of scratches in Allosaurus versus Tyrannosaurus rex, and the Allosaurus ones were more consistent with the puncture-pull hypothesis, where essentially they would reach into the animal they were eating, take a bite and puncture into the skin, and then pull it straight back. Meanwhile, Tyrannosaurus rex probably was doing something slightly different, especially with those thicker teeth that was able to process the body in a different way. So the end goal was the same, but just the process of getting there was different in these different theropod groups. And on the subject of Allosaurus and its feeding, there was a paper in 2021 that I didn't talk about because it was one of those papers that makes you go, are you sure? I really don't think those conclusions are supported. And now there's a paper that goes, yeah, no, those papers, conclusions, they're not supported. Essentially, the first paper was like, hey, Allosaurus was probably forced to scavenge just all the time. And this paper, its title is just, was it really an obligate scavenger or mostly a scavenger? And they could have just said no and it would have been content. However, they do go into all of the evidence for why it wasn't. This includes some evidence from things like Stegosaurus, which actually has one fossil where there's a bite taken out of it, and the bite probably came from an Allosaurus. There's also an Allosaurus that probably has a hole in its pelvis that was caused by a tail spike from a Stegosaurus, and if the Stegosaurus was already dead and it was being scavenged on, I don't think it'd be able to swing its tail into an Allosaurus pelvis. Just hot take, I know. The original paper also treated basically any amount of food that Allosaurus could get from a carcass to be the same as something it would get from something it hunted. Essentially, it slowed down a lot of the decay processes and what else would be scavenged by other animals, and essentially went, yeah, if there's just a dead Diplodocus, the Allosaurus gets all of it, even if it didn't hunt it, which isn't necessarily the most realistic thought to have when you're considering the broad diversity of theropods and of other smaller animals that would have still been carnivorous that would have been present in the Morrison Formation where Allosaurus lived. So yeah, this paper is basically just putting the nail in a coffin of an idea that wasn't the best supported. Also in 2021, there was a paper describing a new Allosauroid, Ulughbegsaurus, coming from Uzbekistan, except now there's a paper saying, hey, maybe this isn't an Allosauroid. And it doesn't go into specific details about that. It essentially just says, hey, the maxilla bone that Ulughbegsaurus was described from doesn't have a lot of the diagnostic characteristics that would make us super certain about saying, yes, this is an Allosauroid. Instead, it's kind of just, this is a big theropod maxilla and we can't really assign it anywhere. And the important part of this is they don't just say that, they also point out that they've found some toe claws that are pretty similar to things like the raptor dinosaurs or dromaeosaurs. And the thing is, what they have found helps to show that there was a massive dromaeosaur in the same environment in the Besekti Formation of Uzbekistan. So essentially we have something that we know for sure is a dromaeosaur that would have been about the size of Ulughbegsaurus. We have something that has been named Ulughbegsaurus, but we don't really have any diagnostics on what group it may belong to. So it could have been a Carcharodontosaur, which is a type of Allosauroid, or it may have been a dromaeosaur, it could have been something else, but regardless, there was at least a large dromaeosaur in this formation. And in fossils that were looked at another time, we have the fossil Tuzoia, which actually comes from the Burgess Shale, so it's not a dinosaur, it's a small little arthropod. But the thing is, we weren't necessarily sure where in the arthropods it belonged. And that's because there's a lot of kind of partiality to this animal. However, now there's some that do have more of that soft tissue preservation, meaning we can look at it under better detail and found that, yeah, we do know what it is. It's a mandibulate. Now, the mandibulates are things that have mandibles. So you can think of ants, they have those pincing jaws. But also crustaceans have similar jaws, and also centipedes and millipedes have similar jaws. So essentially it's those animals. Those are what we're looking at, and this would have belonged to a group immediately next to them. In fact, this whole group, the Hymencarinae, have generally been really poorly understood because most of the time they don't have a soft tissue preservation, and we've been able to know that Tuzoia belong to it, but again, we were just kind of like, they could belong in a lot of different places in the arthropod family tree, but now because of these better fossils of Tuzoia, we can actually go, yeah, no, they're right next to one of the most diverse groups of animals that we have today. And in studies on animals that we've already described, there was a microwear analysis done on 2 different groups. The first, the Anthracotheres, is things that were kind of like hippos and may actually be pretty closely related, and the second was on the Entelodonts, or the so-called hell pigs. And for the hell pigs, what they found is that they probably had a somewhat omnivorous diet. So pretty similar to what we actually find in the modern day wild boar, rather than being much more predatory like some papers have suggested. Meanwhile, the Anthracotheres, they seemed like they were pretty much just eating plants. Like, it really helps to support that kind of hippo idea where it's like, no, they weren't really eating a lot of bony material, and so it was mostly just plants. Now, with the hell pigs, I will say they didn't include Daedon, which is the largest of these animals that potentially was the most carnivorous, and so that's something they should do in the future, but hopefully that'll be done, and regardless, it does help us to understand more that a lot of these animals were pretty generalist, at least when they first started evolving. And then eventually also the pigs evolved pretty close to the hell pigs. They're pretty closely related, they're not direct ancestors, but it means that this kind of generalist lifestyle worked pretty well for the suids, the pigs. Meanwhile, for the more carnivorous mammals, we have the carnivorans, and these aren't all of the carnivorous mammals, but it's a pretty broad group of them. And this time this paper was looking at the saber-toothed that has evolved in this group many, many times, and tried to see how they functioned. And what they found is there were different pressures and different stresses that each of these teeth would have been better or less suited to, meaning that there's not some kind of like one-size-fits-all pathway to having effective saber teeth. Instead, there's a lot of variation. And so we need to be a little bit more considerate when we're measuring how these animals may have been more different than we might originally have given them credit for. And more studies on things we've already found, but this time, maybe one of the most frustrating animals, Chilesaurus. Chilesaurus comes from Chile, shocking, I know, but for a long time it's been really inconclusive as to what group it actually belonged to. So like, oh, it's a theropod dinosaur. No, it's an ornithischian. No, it's a really early branching group of dinosaurs that we don't really have other fossils that are related to it from. So this paper essentially took all of the different data sets that those previous papers used and added more information into them, essentially tried to compile them all to try and get a better idea of what Chilesaurus was. And what they found is actually kind of nothing, because it's still really, really inconclusive. Chilesaurus, we really just need like a perfect specimen of, because it seems like this really important key to unlocking how dinosaurs may have first evolved. And like you can look through the different phylogenies they've made. There's a lot of variation in where Chilesaurus shows up, but also where Chilesaurus makes the relationships between other dinosaurs show up. It's really, really frustrating, and hopefully we'll get some better ideas on this in the future, but again, right now it's just so inconclusive and it drives me insane, and it's such an interesting animal, but it drives me insane. Sticking with dinosaurs, but this time the avian dinosaurs, so a true bird, we have Ichthyornis, which would have still had teeth, but was very well on its line to modern birds. In general, Ichthyornis has been mostly known from skull pieces, but now there's 40 new specimens, of which 6 of them or so are really, really great, that help us understand better what was happening to Ichthyornis behind the head. And this has some really cool implications. For example, there's some variation we can see. So this is things like there being 10 to 12 vertebra right over the hips. Something that's been really hard to know, and it helps to say, hey, this isn't a diagnostic feature of this species. It's something that's, there's variation. I mean, variation I get because I only had 3 wisdom teeth. You wouldn't call me a new species just because of that. There's also the acromion process on the scapula that varies quite a bit. It was previously considered to be one of the most diagnostic features of Ichthyornis, but because of this variation, it's really showing that, yeah, no, we can't use that as a diagnostic feature. It is too variable of a trait. But that doesn't mean necessarily that it's useless, because there are still things that help us to understand better what Ichthyosaurus would have been like in its environment. And these include some of the toe bones, which would have been wider than most other birds at this time. But considering Ichthyornis, fish, ichthy, it was probably living around the sea, and so those wider toe bones probably helped it to paddle through the ocean when it was just resting on the surface. So there's a lot that's going on here that helps us to understand much better the kind of body plan that Ichthyornis would have had. And on the subject of toe bones, there was also a look at the feet of a lot of fossil birds and bird relatives. So this includes things like Microraptor, which was a dromaeosaur, not a bird, but probably glided through trees. So again, really helpful for understanding how the diversity of birds and gliding and flying dinosaurs really started to develop. What they found is, yeah, there's a lot of diversity. For example, with Microraptor, it would have had pretty good grasping claws, similar to animals like Deinonychus, meaning it could have very well pinned prey and held it on the ground so that it could actually kill the animal. Meanwhile, something like Ankylosaurus actually seems like it was better built for grabbing prey out of the sky, so potentially going for insects using its claws, but more likely than not grabbing smaller birds. Archaeopteryx, meanwhile, doesn't really seem to have lived in the trees. Instead, it was probably mostly ground dwelling. And that's really cool. It could have been almost like a modern day roadrunner, only with not the backwards facing extra toe, but still that kind of lifestyle, running and living mostly on the ground, but being able to get up at least a little bit off the ground if it needed to. There was also a new paper on one of the birds that was discussed in there, and actually it's a new species of the genus of bird that was discussed. Confuciusornis is a species of bird that was included in the previous study, but this time there's a new species of it. Confuciusornis chiffon is the new species, and it comes from the same environment in the J-hole biota. The most important thing, though, is that it had a slightly pronounced bone coming off of one of the hands in the wing. Now, this likely correlated with an extra period of bone growth, but importantly, it also means that essentially it was probably filling a slightly different flying niche than the other Confuciusornis species. So even in just Confuciusornis, you can see the broad diversity of different niches that a lot of these early birds and their relatives were starting to fill. And that actually brings us back to the next paper, which is on Microraptor, which I've already mentioned. I talked about it being able to pin food to the ground, and seems like it did that pretty well, at least some of the time. And that's because this new paper describes a Microraptor that had a mammal foot inside of its stomach. So it ate mammals. Like, that's pretty straightforward and easy to say. However, it doesn't seem like it was a specialist, because there have been some papers that said, oh, Microraptor was a specialist. One because it had a bird in its stomach. One because it had a lizard in its stomach. One because it had some fish scales in its stomach. This paper just goes, hey, maybe it was a generalist, which seems pretty reasonable considering that kind of pinning lifestyle probably worked pretty well on a lot of different types of prey. And now a paper on my wife's favorite group of pterosaurs, which were flying reptiles that lived alongside the dinosaurs. These ones being the Ulughbegsaurus, and they're her favorite because she actually doesn't like them at all. She thinks they are some of the goofiest looking animals there are, and she also can't spell their name very consistently because she's silly. But Anura comes from frog, and then nath is mouth, so it's the frog-mouthed pterosaurs. And that's because, their heads were kind of shaped like frog heads. Sometimes they could be even wider than they were long. And a lot of times this has been suggested that, hey, what they were probably doing is flying around at night and catching insects. And so what these authors sought to do is just kind of mathematically prove that. And what they did is they essentially looked at the mouth, the gape it would have had, and saw how well it would have actually been able to live that kind of lifestyle. Now, based on that study of those different numbers and comparing that to many modern animals, including some nightjars, which are birds that fly around at night catching insects, but also bats, which fly around at night catching insects, they found that, the Ulughbegsaurus, they flew around at night catching insects. It's not necessarily the most revolutionary idea, but it's nice to have it finally in pen and paper where it's proven, or at least mostly supported, that this is the kind of lifestyle they were having. And when we consider animals flying, sometimes we don't actually consider animals in the water, even though they do kind of fly. Like the air, water is a fluid, so you can get through in a lot of the same kind of mechanics, such as when penguins are flying through the water using their flippers as wings. They are wings, but they're wings that turn into flippers. Regardless, this paper sought to see how the Sauropterygians, or the Plesiosaurs, may have done this. And what they did is they basically just made a model of the different bones in the organisms, and were able to try and essentially just map out where they would have moved. And they then compared this to a lot of different animals in the modern day, and how they swim. And this includes a lot of sea turtles, which have some slightly different mechanics when they do swim. And what they found is that the plesiosaurs probably swam more like sea turtles than like penguins, which essentially just means that as they were paddling their arms, they would have also rotated the tip of their arm in order to get a little extra thrust on it. Meanwhile, penguins, when they're swimming, mostly keep the tips of their wings more or less stationary, which gives them more stability, but maybe slightly less push. And staying in marine reptiles in the oceans during the Mesozoic, but not in the Sauropterygians, we're going to be looking at the Ichthyosaurs, the more dolphin-like oceanic reptiles. And these finds actually come from when they just evolved during the Triassic, and specifically in Nevada. The thing with Nevada is it's not an ocean right now, but 200 some odd million years ago it was, and that deposited a lot of rock, some of which contains a lot of fossils of very large ichthyosaurs. And the authors use that to suggest, hey, maybe the ichthyosaurs were deliberately grouping here. And I'm not totally sold on the idea just yet, but it does seem at least mostly reasonable. This very easily could have been a nesting ground, and that's because they're pretty much all fully grown adults, with the exception of a few that are either brand new, just born neonates, or embryos so still inside the mother animal. Which is really good evidence that, yeah, maybe this was that kind of nesting environment where this is where they would release their young off into the ocean where it was moderately safe. The fossils also come from a pretty thick section of rock, which was probably being deposited for around 1 million years or so, give or take on either side. So it is pretty good evidence that, hey, they were coming here for this reason, but at the same time, in my opinion, it could have also just been some strange place where maybe there were toxic tides and just a bunch of them died while they were still more spread out. Rather than collecting for a singular purpose, maybe they just all collected here because of the tides. It's hard to know for sure. So I'm not totally sold on the idea, but it is a pretty solid concept, at least in theory. And I think with a little more research, this kind of idea will eventually hold. And staying in the oceans, but this time even further back before vertebrates were really as large as they became, we actually have something that's probably eating some of the first fish, and those are the chelicerates, specifically the sea scorpions or eurypterids. Chelicerates have specialized feeding appendages. So if you think about scorpions, it's not the big claws there, instead it's going to be the claws right by the mouth that help to break up food. However, many eurypterids actually developed chelicerae that are really similar to the claws, the larger claws at least, in scorpions, which are actually on the pedipalps. Regardless though, they probably served a similar function for catching prey. And so this paper did a lot of analyses using models of these different claws to try and see how well they would stand up to different stresses. And they found that there was a lot of feeding diversity in the chelicerates and especially the sea scorpions. For example, Acuturramus could focus stress onto the many serrations, meaning that it would have been really great at penetrating into and grabbing softer prey. Meanwhile, there were others like Pterygotus that were pretty similar to most modern-day scorpions, meaning it probably had a more generalized diet. And then finally, you have the really large ones like Echolopterus, which were able to focus the stresses just on the tips of certain points, which would have been really great for getting through the hard, bony exterior of many of the bony fish that lived at this time. This is a time of the placoderms, so a lot of the early fish had these really hard bony head shields that would have probably helped them not get eaten. However, then you have things like Echolopterus, which essentially just evolved a way to get past that head shield regardless. So we might actually be seeing a kind of evolutionary arms race in this time period, during the Silurian into the Devonian, which is essentially just saying that as some of these fish started getting eaten, some of them started to evolve defenses. And then the sea scorpions evolved attacking methods to get past those defenses, and so on and so forth. But just before this time period in the Ordovician to Silurian, there was a mass extinction. And this paper isn't necessarily about the animals that live there, but a potential cause of that extinction. Because this was done by paleomagnetists. And don't ask me a ton about paleomagnetism. They could be paleomagicians for all I know. That's a lot of math and science. But regardless, what they were finding is that essentially the polar core, so essentially where the North Pole was not at all in the same place. Essentially, in the Silurian, it was probably tilted about 50 degrees, which would have essentially left a lot of the planet in a kind of odd stasis. With the magnetic pole being so far to the side, That also changes a lot of the structures of how different fluids are moving in the mantle. And what they also find is that because of this, relative to the rest of the planet, the continents were probably moving really, really slowly, which means some of them would have been in darkness for a really long time. And this probably led to a lot of the glaciation which occurred in the late Ordovician, which then, because a lot of the water in the oceans was taken up into glaciers, caused sea levels to drop and a lot of extinction with a lot of the marine life that would have been around at the time. And now into my final one that I probably could have fitted in with the Ankylosaur tails, but I didn't, so it's going here. And that's, how fast could sauropods move their tails? There's been a lot of suggestions that sauropods with their massive tails and tail muscles could have moved the tips of their tails at supersonic speeds and, been devastating to any predator that tried to attack it. This paper sought to see if that was actually the case, because a physical body moving itself at supersonic speeds sounds kind of painful. I don't think my hand would be able to survive that kind of motion, and sauropod tails probably couldn't either, at least according to this paper. Instead, it seems much more likely that a sauropod tail could only move at about 55 miles per hour, or around 100 kilometers, which is still really fast, especially when it's attached to a multi-ton animal. So it very well could have still been at least a line of defense, but it definitely wasn't going supersonic. And then we have the final paper that I actually did an entirely separate video on, which is Nadovenator, which may have been a swimming raptor. Some of the ribs it has are actually pointed back more than they are in other theropod dinosaurs, which might mean it may have been more streamlined. When I mentioned Mongolia having poor stratigraphy, Nadovenator also kind of falls into that, because it was found in an environment that was much more like a kind of sand dune desert type environment. But there's some formations there that may have had water, streams, some lakes and playas, where it could have also made its living, but we don't find its fossils there. We just find it in the desert, the one that we have. So it's really hard to know for sure where it was living. And so we need to do some more study to really nail down whether or not it was living in the water, but you can check out my video for kind of the whole discussion on that fossil. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Oh, my ankles. Be sure to check out our Patreon and our links below to help support the channel. It really helps us keep this all going, because it's a lot of work trying to get through all these papers every month. Joining the Patreon, you can also help vote for some of our content that we make on here for fossil animals that you find interesting. You, my lovely viewer. Be safe, everyone. Take care, and like the shirt says, don't go extinct.